The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, I'm Susan Goldberg, the director of the Minneapolis Public Library. Welcome to a discussion with Gloria Steinem. Gloria is here today to discuss her new book, Moving Beyond Words. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
It's really an honor for me to have the opportunity to interview you, Gloria, because you've really been someone that I've admired and respected. And when I read the book, I was really struck by your introductory quote, and I'm going to read it, and I'm going to ask you a question about it. You said, and that you said this in 1994 at Take Our Daughters to Work Day. Now we have the dreams and tools to move beyond words and history, beyond the possible to the imagined, and into a life both ancient and new, where we will look back to see our present dreams trailing behind us as markers of where we have been. Now, I want to ask you, what do you hope for women in the last years of the 20th century?
I hope that we can begin to see both the future and the past. I think that there is so much to be learned in what we have set aside as prehistory and not really looked at. That is the pre-patriarchal, pre-nationalistic, pre-racist kind of past in which structures of human organization were quite different, and the idea of balance with nature was quite different. We still see these cultures as indigenous cultures on every continent, but we really have not learned from them. We've cut ourselves off. And at the same time, look to a future which is not going to be like the past, of course, but which can get past this hierarchical way of thinking as the only way of thinking, and the male-female paradigm as the beginning of all other hierarchies. So I was trying to put these two things together while recognizing that our words, the meanings of our words, really have been formed for the most part in the center, which is the hierarchical time of history. So in a way, we've gone beyond the meanings of the words we have and are struggling to make new ones to suit our new dreams.
How do you think our daughters and our granddaughters and the generations that come after them can make that move beyond words? Do they have to rebel against the words, rebel against the structure, or do you think that they can sort of find it within themselves and within the examples, the markers, to go beyond where we are now?
Well, I think we need to trust our experience, and sometimes there is a word that fits it, and sometimes there isn't. So we both need to honor the words that suit our experience and find new words. I mean, for instance, we've invented, in fact, just in the last 25 years of the women's movement, phrases like battered women, like displaced homemaker, sexual harassment, homophobia. All these words really didn't exist in usage 20 years ago. They were just called life. You know, there was no phrase for that experience. So we have tried to find new phrases. Reproductive freedom, instead of what used to be called birth control, because control rightly meant that some other group up there was going to make the decisions, and what we were trying to say was that we need to empower individuals to make their own decisions. So sometimes we need to make new phrases or hybrid words. That's why the language is so alive and glorious, you know, that we can continue to do that. And sometimes we need to look to the true meaning of words as they exist. I mean, the word feminism, as defined in the dictionary, is a good word that, you know, means the belief, I would say the fact, but I'll settle for the belief in the full social, economic, political equality of women and men. The difference between erotica and pornography, I would argue, is contained in the words. Porne means female slavery, so pornography is the depiction of female slavery. Erotica comes from eros, which has some idea of free choice and mutual pleasure, love. So, you know, we can use that to make the distinction that we also made between rape and sex, we can make between pornography and erotica. So it's a mix. I don't think we we're not going against for the sake of going against, nor inventing for the sake of invention. We're trying to describe our experience.
Well, let's get a word that's a charged word. In an interview in Time magazine in March of 1992, you responded to a question about why so many women are reluctant to identify themselves as feminists by saying, not an exact quote, that if you're a woman, the only alternative to feminism, or the opposite of feminism, is masochism. I thought that was a wonderful quote. Why do you think so many women who see the value of the women's movement, who see that they have opportunities that they didn't have 20 years ago or 30 years ago, are so reluctant to call themselves feminists?
Well, I think there are two problems with the word feminism. One is people don't know what it means, and if they go to the dictionary and see what it means, then something else. But the other thing is they do know what it means. I mean, we have to face the fact that this is not a sort of public relations movement here. It is a revolution. If you say you're a feminist, that means you're not just for equal pay or whatever for yourself, but for all women, which is a major transformation of the power structure. There is a difference in public opinion polls between the response to questions like, do you consider yourself a feminist, versus do you call yourself, with the second one getting a lesser response. So I think women are anticipating punishment to some extent for calling themselves feminists. But the other thing about this is that we need to say compared to what? A greater percentage of American women call themselves feminists than call themselves Republicans. And we don't talk about that. You know, I think as women, we come in to say, suppose we came into a room and there were 100 people who were enthusiastic about equality and wanted to work, you know, and there were 5 other women over there who said, I won't have anything to do with it, you know. We would go over and try to convince the 5 instead of working with the 100. So I do think that some of this is within ourselves, and we need to say compared to what, and why am I so uncomfortable with opposition?
Isn't it true now that we respond to labels, and we hear a word like feminism or family values, and we immediately internalize what that means? And sometimes we can't hear beyond the labels. And I think that's what some of the things that you say in that book says, let's go beyond the labels.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's absolutely true. But I do think that with feminism, well, we also should recognize that we've just come out of 12 years of the Reagan and Bush administrations that did a great deal, that tried very hard to make words like feminism, affirmative action, liberal, and so on into bad words. So in some ways, it's amazing that the usage of the word feminist has only fallen by 10 or 12 points in 12 years, in spite of all those efforts. But we need to have words that stand for what we hope for. So, you know, I do think that though we're trying to release individuality and uniqueness, we're still in a society that's unequal enough. So we do need words to indicate that we care about equality. And if you don't call yourself a feminist, actually, you get the same treatment as a woman, the same unequal treatment, and you don't get the support that would come from sending out the signal.
I work in a profession which has been labeled a women's profession, librarianship. And it's true that most librarians, or the vast majority of librarians, are women, but until recently, the vast majority of library directors have been men. And it's very interesting to work in a profession in which there are so many women, many of whom consider themselves feminists, who still have to battle against the patriarchal system in which, you know, the men were the leaders and the women did the work. And if that happens in a so-called women's profession, what kind of battles have women been experiencing in other types of work?
Well, here, yes, I mean, it is the same. Well, either you're a token in a male field, in which case you suffer loneliness and so on, or you're in a mostly female field, a pink-collar ghetto, as it's called, in which case the profession is devalued. So we just need to understand that is something that's not uniquely happening to us. I mean, in there I think I talk about the profession of bookkeeper, which used to be a good profession. It was mostly male. And then when it got to be too many females, which usually happens at about a third, and the whole profession starts to tilt like a neighborhood, then it became a less honored and less well-paid profession, and white males, invented certified public accountant to get certification processes that kept out all women and men of color for a very long time. So we have to understand that we will devalue professions as we occupy them, and just make our minds that we're going to devalue everything. We're going to the White House,
all of those
right. But it is very frustrating because the hierarchy reconstitutes itself, within structures, and we just need to make sure that we're not cooperating with this in some way. That we are transforming that as much as we can.
One of the things that I really appreciated in reading the first essay in the book, What If Freud Were Phyllis, is the aha factor. The aha factor, and you use what you call the theory of reversal, and really create a story in which Phyllis Freud is the mother of psychiatry and therapy. That aha factor and that reversal really makes one see herself in a different light. Would you give us some examples of the reversal theory that you use in that chapter?
Well, historically in my life, I got into this business of reversal because it dawned on me that, of course, white skin actually makes us more subject to wrinkles and aging, and yet white folks, had convinced themselves and others that it was somehow superior. So it did dawn on me that whatever the superior group has is good, and whatever the less powerful group has is not so good. So the first thing that I did in this reversal vein was to write a little essay called What If Men Could Menstruate? Obviously it would become a great thing, and they would brag about how long and how much, and there would be a National Institute of Dysmenorrhea. I mean, it goes on and on. And the intellectuals, speaking of librarianship and so on, would do the most with it, because I can just hear them saying, well, of course women can't be mathematicians without this inbuilt sense of the measure of time, and so on. And I do think that reversal is a very useful way of detecting bias that is so deep that it's perceived as being natural, And since that is still true for women in so many circumstances, it's very helpful to put in the place of women the name of a religious group or ethnic or racial group to see what is really being said. For instance, I'm on a book tour now, and there is a male author who for years has refused to have any women drivers. And so I hear about this from
because they're not safe drivers.
Right. So so I said, I'm going to object to this and write a letter to the publisher, because what would happen if he refused to have any Jewish drivers? People would be more, I hope that people would be
or any black
upset,
driver.
or any black drivers, right? Or why do we get a reputation for having no sense of humor if we don't laugh at dumb blonde jokes? We shouldn't laugh at dumb black jokes or dumb blonde jokes. So I just think that the reversal is very useful. And of course, I must say this is the most elaborate reversal I've ever attempted, because it went on, it just kind of got out of control.
Well, I was so caught up with reading the essay and the footnotes that I kept skipping back and forth from the essay to the footnotes, and then I went back and read the essay and then the footnotes all in one. And it's really a fascinating look at, first of all, at Phyllis Freud, not a very nice person, and Sigmund, who obviously was not a very nice person either. And there are two myths there. The real Sigmund Freud, and then the Phyllis Freud, and what she may have done if she were in the position that Sigmund
I think
was
that,
in.
to say, as he did, that anatomy is destiny is crazy on its face, but if you reverse it, it does help you to see how crazy it is. In other words, superiority, you can use anything to prove superiority, whatever the superior group has. So that's what I was trying to do, and say that, of course, Phyllis would say that men were terminally narcissistic and fragile because they have their genitals perched so precariously and vulnerably on the outside of their bodies, and of course men can't be great creative artists. They lack the womb, the very source of, you can just hear it. The point, of course, being that we should think about cooperation instead of domination, that the point, is our individuality and our uniqueness. So I hope that this exercise, which I started when I had to go speak to the American Psychiatric Association about the sexual abuse of patients, and I was afraid they were going to stone me to death, so I thought that I would invent something that might produce empathy, which is where Phyllis came from.
And they weren't very empathetic?
Well, I think it helped, actually, because it loosened up the otherwise very professional academic kind of atmosphere enough so that one psychiatrist got up afterwards and said to me angrily, because I had been talking about the sexual abuse of patients, but you don't understand, my patients behave very seductively with me. And essentially he was admitting that he was having sex with his patients. And the other psychiatrists, who of course, were appalled by this, or some of the other ones anyway, said to him, I can't believe you call yourself a psychiatrist. And then it all they erupted into argument themselves, which is good, because the better psychiatrists were understanding, often for the first time, what patients had been experiencing in the privacy of the other psychiatrist's office.
I appreciated the fight that broke out among the psychiatrists, and the second time they invited you back, you spoke to a real session as opposed to a rump session of the group. Did you get treated in a more respectful way at that point?
Yes, well, actually the second one was when the fighting broke out. Yeah, so yeah, it was better. It was serious. I don't know if I got treated better, but it was more serious. So that was worth it.
In the final essay of your book, Doing 60, you talk about the need for personal role models. Who are your personal role models?
Well, I must say that growing up, I really didn't have role models outside of books. That's why I treasure libraries so much. I spent all my time going to a little neighborhood library in Toledo and reading my way through the stacks. Louisa May Alcott was my role model. I didn't see any in life. There was Doris Day or Sonia Henney. That wasn't very practical. So it wasn't until much later in life that I really began to have role models like Bella Abzug, for instance, or Alice Walker, whose work matters so much to me as an author, or but that came much later in life, living real role models as opposed to ones in books.
Did you know when you were a child using the library that you wanted to be a writer?
That's interesting. I didn't think I could be a writer. I'd seen very few women who or very few writers who made a living as writers, but no women. So it was only much, much later that I began to think this was a possibility. But I realized in reading Orwell's work about being a writer that I had a habit that he says is a dead giveaway, which is that I used to describe everything in the third person. So I used to get up in the morning and think she got up and went to the,
When did you start writing it down?
Oh, that's a good question. I remember writing poetry when I was little, and I remember that I wrote a Thanksgiving poem which the teacher didn't believe I had written, and I never wrote another poem.
August Wilson, the playwright, tells a story about when he was in high school. He wrote an essay, and the teacher wouldn't believe that he had written this essay, and she refused to accept it from him. And he left school at that point and got his education at the library. So sometimes the people who should be our role models, the teachers, don't put enough faith in the students that they have.
Well, it's hard. I think we're still struggling with this because now all the kind of surveys show that kids, boys in school are called on about 3 times more often than girls, and even teachers of great goodwill may not see this because even when they see the films of the boys talking much more, they perceive that the talking is equal because they're still measuring, as I fear many of us are, girls against the expectation of female silence, of being a good listener. So it seems like they're talking a lot, even if they're talking a little. And that's, in a way, what's exciting about these times now are the aha moments, as you say, you know, the moments when we realize what we've been doing and we realize why something happens, or we say some unsayable bit of experience and we hear 6 other women say, "You feel like that?" I thought only I felt like that. It is exciting if we can just manage to keep a grip on trusting our own and each other's experience instead of the myth that's out there.
You have a poem that you wrote in the book. And
yes, that was very daring on my part.
I think it was very daring, and I love the title, which is, I hope to be an old woman who dresses very inappropriately. Is it safe to dress inappropriately if you're an old woman? Do you think that's the only time it's safe for women?
Well, I confess that when I was in my 20s and 30s, I used to have fantasies about being very old. This was, 20s especially, was pre-feminism in my life. And I tried to do an old lady book because there were all these wonderful old women, but of course I couldn't sell it. But anyway, and I realized, even then I realized that society was making me wish my life away because I imagined freedom and age. So I consciously tried to stop doing that, and then of course feminism came along and helped us all to begin to humanize the feminine role. But there is still a way in which older age, you know, after the role is over, is more free. I mean, Carolyn Heilbrunn has written wonderfully about this in Writing a Woman's Life, that women become ourselves after 50 because we're off the patriarchal family map. It's scary and invisible, but it's also free. And the best way I've been able to express this, because I worry about younger listeners, if I had heard somebody talking about being 60 when I was 30, I wouldn't have listened. So I try to explain it by saying, you know, remember when you were a little girl of 8 or 9 or 10 and you were this kind of clear-eyed, I know what I want, I know what I think creature who climbed trees and said things like, it's not fair, you know. Then the female role comes along at 11 or 12 or 13 and we become female impersonators. Well, after 50 or 60, I think we go back to that true self, that little girl.
That you can climb the tree and say it's not fair,
and wear what you want, say
what
what you want. At least much more so now. There's great economic suffering in that period of life for women because women over 65 of all races are the single poorest demographic group in this country. But I fear that we won't really put effort into solving those problems unless we treasure that period of life and understand that it is free and important and a culmination and exciting and really another country.
That other country is going to be reached by masses of people in the next 10 years. The pre-baby boom generation and the baby boom generation are, you know, hitting the older years, and I have a feeling that that's going to change the way older people are treated in the country, or at least I'd like to believe that. Do you think the mass of people is going to have an effect?
Well, it could, and I hope it will, but we can't count on numbers. You know, nowhere is it written that larger groups of people win out, you know, if the power is in the hands of the few. So I think we have to make sure that we don't go into this country quietly, you know, that we go in kicking and screaming about the injustices and talking equally loudly about the advantages and the good parts of it. Because nothing happens automatically. It depends what we do every day. There's no such thing as forces of history that continue without the actions of ordinary everyday people.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about your book was the essay Sex, Lies, and Advertising, in which you talk about the influence that advertising has on the editorial content of magazines, on what is advertised in so-called women's magazines. Ms. Magazine was an example. What advertisements are aimed at women or avoided. And I've read those magazines and realized the juxtaposition of the ads and the content, and it was, I always felt there was something wrong, but I didn't know quite how to articulate it. Do you think it's changed any, or is it still as strong as it was, this editorial and advertising?
Yeah, it's changed only a little bit in that products and services that are not only for women, but are people products and services, like cars and insurance and financial services and all of those things that we all use, have begun to advertise in women's magazines for the first time in the last 20 years. And Ms. helped to break those categories, that is, to get them into a women's magazine for the first time. They have a higher ethical standard because they're used to addressing men. So they're not so likely to demand complimentary editorial copy. However, so there are a few more pages in women's magazines that are free to do editorial things, articles. But all the women's products still demand complimentary copy. So women's magazines, I mean, to use reversal again, if a man's magazine had to publish an article every month on how to shave in order to get ads for shaving cream, it would be experiencing what is routine in women's magazines. So there's still very few pages left over for honest opinion. There's nothing wrong with writing about clothes or makeup or food. That's great, but they can't be critical. You know, we would like to know what fabrics are better or which clothes are being produced in sweatshops that exploit other women. You'll never find that in a women's magazine.
No, I was quite amazed to read about the restrictions of how many separate pages there had to be from some kind of editorial content, what could not be mentioned in the magazine unless for the advertiser to read in it. I had no idea that the restrictions were there.
We really should not be paying for women's magazines at all because they're catalogs. We should be getting them free. And we should be writing to advertisers and saying, listen, I'm not buying your product until I see that your ads surrounded by good articles, short stories, fiction, things that are not in control of the ad. Then I'll buy your product. In addition, magazines could change their financial structure so that the readers pay more for their magazines and they're not so much subsidized, but the balance is different. Therefore, we wouldn't be so dependent on advertising income. We buy books, and it's turned out with Ms. Magazine, as it happens, that we're making money for the first time, even though we take no advertising.
Well, I've enjoyed this afternoon's conversation, and I'd like to thank you for coming and having a discussion with us today. Thank Gloria Steinem, who is the author of the book Moving Beyond Words. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for guarding books and keeping them in our lives.
Thank you.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.